Defenders of the free market must often contend with accusations from Christians that capitalism is immoral, despite its track record of delivering the goods. Jay Richards says there should be no contradiction between Christianity and capitalism. He lays out his case in Money, Greed, and God, why capitalism is the solution and not the problem. He spoke at the Cato Institute November 4th, 2009. This is a portion of his speech.
I would maintain that most of the stuff that a person needs to be an educated citizen, to be able to evaluate public policy in economics, doesn't require that you have an advanced degree or even that you've had a course in macroeconomics. It just requires that you think carefully through various issues. And in fact, I think almost every intellectual mistake that Christians and frankly others make about economics can be boiled down into one of these 8 myths that I talk about in the book. Now, I'm not going to obviously talk about all 8 myths here today. I want to just briefly touch on 3 so that you kind of get an idea of what I'm trying to do. First, what I call the piety myth, and most of you are probably familiar with the so-called law of unintended consequences. The intentions for a policy, of course, don't bear any relation to the actual effects of the policy. City Council's intentions on a rent control policy might be to help the poor have affordable housing. The effect, nevertheless, is going to be to create a shortage of affordable housing, as we all know from experience. The piety myth, though, I think is especially acute problem for religious people and Christians in particular. And the reason is this. If you're a Christian or you're just a theist in general, then you think that why you do things is morally relevant. That is, your piety, your intentions, why you do things has something to do with your status before God. God cares about why I do things. He doesn't just want me to do good things. He wants me to do them for the right reason. We're commanded to love the Lord our God with our hearts and with our souls and with our minds. So we focus on the heart part. The problem is, as we all know, the heart part, that is why we do something, while it might be spiritually or morally relevant in our relationship with God, is not economically relevant. In fact, in most cases, it's economically irrelevant. This is such an important point that Henry Hazlitt, in his terrific book called Economics in One Lesson, actually defined the art of economics this way. Here's what Hazlitt said. He said, "The art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but at the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy not merely for one group, but for all groups." Now, notice he's not talking about the science of economics. This is the art of economics. And the art of economics, Hazlitt thinks, it's something like an intellectual disposition that you get down in your bones, so that it's in you at an intuitive level, so that for any policy that someone proposes, your mind immediately asks this question, and then what will happen? Right? Regardless of the policy, regardless of the purposes or intentions of those who are advocating it, if you're practiced in the art of economics, your mind will say, and then what would happen? What will be the consequences? And you trace those consequences. Most of the time, this is not rocket science. We could usually do this logically, and in most economic policies, we can also do it empirically because we have experience with it. Now, sometimes when I speak on Christian college campuses, I will spend an entire hour doing nothing but talking about this. I was at Houston Baptist University about a month ago. I spent an hour simply giving examples of situations in which a number of influential people believe the piety myth, focused all of their moral attention and energy on their intentions, and spent apparently no time thinking about the consequences of policies, inevitably to very bad result. Let me just give you one very brief example, the current example, the financial crisis. Now, obviously, this is a very complicated issue. I've spent 6 months reading books and articles on the financial crisis and still don't feel like I fully grasp it. But I do think at the foundation of the crisis, which we all recall had something to do with the subprime mortgage crisis, was a series of good intentions that influenced policy over a period of decades. Now, what was the good intention? The good intention was to help lower-income Americans and more Americans have access to affordable housing. That's good. All things being equal, most of us would like for people to own their homes rather than merely rent. But as we all now know, this led to a series of policies, one of encouraging private banks to lower their eligibility standards for mortgages, and the same sort of thing in so-called government-sponsored enterprises, these semi-public, semi-private banks, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which changed the series of incentives over a period of years so that loan officers, who in a free market would have acted entirely differently in the system that had been set up, made decisions that led in the end to a huge number of defaults on loans. Now, the problem is, of course, is that the financial crisis has been blamed not on a series of bad policy decisions and incentives, but, of course, on the free market. But just think about it for a minute. Let's say you're a loan officer at a local bank. All right, you're going to lend someone money, and you know your bank is going to get stuck with the loan. You're not going to be able to offload it anywhere. Everybody's going to remember that you're the one that made the loan, right? And you got to hold on to it. You don't want it to default over a 30-year period. You're going to act in a certain way, right? You're going to want to make sure the person borrowing the money can afford it. You're going to want to know something about their credit rating. You're going to want them to have some skin in the game, so you're probably going to want them to have a down payment. All these kind of natural market incentives click in so that everything you do will be organized so that ideally you can make a profit, but certainly that you don't lend someone money for a house that they can't afford. Now change the scenario just slightly so that the loan officer now knows, in fact, nobody's really looking all that closely at the criteria for the person borrowing the loan. And in fact, there's strange legal and social pressure to lend money to people in particular who have bad credit ratings and have very little evidence that they'll be able to repay the loans. You also know you'll quickly be able to offload the loan, that loan itself will be chopped up and securitized, will be amplified in various derivatives and sold to places like little northern towns in Norway. Completely lost, right? Your incentives there are going to be entirely different. And yet that's the scenario that we set up. It's totally strange, a complete sort of subversion of market incentives, all motivated for good intentions, right? All motivated by many people who had to have believed the piety myth, because the simple incentives and the problems, you can describe them as I did, I think, in 2 minutes. And yet they happened. I think those kinds of policies, primarily at least, if not only happen because a lot of people believe the piety myth. The piety myth, I think, is especially acute for religious people because we think why we did things are important. But I would argue that despite that, when we're in the policy realm, whether you're religious or non-religious, what you do should take up all of our attention. We should focus morally on the effects of a policy and simply ignore our intentions. Good intentions can lead to bad policies. Bad intentions can lead to good policies. It simply doesn't matter. Well, that's the first myth. The second one, and the one I want to spend most of the time on here, is the so-called greed myth. Now, greed myth is especially problematic because both critics and champions of capitalism, I think, believe it. Now, what's the greed myth? The greed myth is simply believing that the essence of capitalism is greed, or that capitalism is based on greed. This is an extremely popular idea. In fact, several of my most appreciated free marketers, people like John Stossel and Walter Williams, have made this argument. It's always sort of immortalized by this Michael Douglas character, Gordon Gekko, in the great Oliver Stone movie in 1987, Wall Street. I'm sure some of you, at least the ones of you that are my age or older, have seen this. If you haven't seen it and you're younger, Stone is doing a sequel, so you get to see it next year, actually. But Gekko gives this terrific speech in the middle of the film that goes like this. He said, "Greed is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed cuts through and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all its forms has marked the upward surge of mankind." Quite inspiring. Now you might say, okay, well, yeah, right, but this character, he's fictional. He's an Oliver Stone character. This is Oliver Stone's caricature of the capitalist. Of course, you probably know that's not true. In fact, some of the most prominent defenders of capitalism in the 20th century made something like the same argument. Ayn Rand, for instance, whose books still sell about 300,000 copies a year. Here's how she put it in one of her books. She said, "Capitalism and altruism are incompatible. They're philosophical opposites. They cannot coexist in the same man or in the same society." She wrote a book called The Virtue of Selfishness. Now, it probably doesn't take a lot of historical knowledge to know that selfishness or greed has always been considered in the Judeo-Christian tradition one of the 7 deadly sins, right? So to identify it with a virtue is at the very least a kind of rhetorical non-starter for anyone whose moral sensibilities are shaped by the Judeo-Christian tradition. And this was my problem for years. In fact, I started reading Rand when I was a senior in college. I was completely transfixed by her arguments, utterly persuaded in her arguments against collectivism, but nevertheless continued to be uneasy about her basic argument. It wasn't until I read people like George Gilder and Michael Novak several years later that I realized, no, in fact, you can make a moral defense of capitalism quite apart from this. But there's still this problem. Is it true? Is capitalism somehow based on greed, on selfishness? And a lot of people actually think it's not just Rand that said that. In fact, the sort of father of modern capitalism, Adam Smith, made an argument like this. Now, most people don't actually read Smith's very thick tome, The Wealth of Nations, they read a couple of choice quotes pulled out of context. So let me give you a couple of examples. Here's Adam Smith on self-interest. This is in his Wealth of Nations. He says, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we expect our meal, but from his regard to his own interest." Of course, Smith says all sorts of things like this. Elsewhere, he talks about the invisible hand. Here's what he says. "In spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity, business people are led as if by an invisible hand, and thus without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interest of the society." Now, if you look at this superficially, you might think, well, he's saying more or less the same thing. Greedy, self-interested business people through the market somehow lead to sort of good results. So is Smith saying greed is good? That's how a lot of people read him. In fact, I've got a collection of well-known economists and scholars that think Smith was arguing more or less the same thing that Ayn Rand was. But he wasn't. In fact, this is the only place that I think requires, maybe 2 minutes of attention, because I think there's a couple of really important nuances here that people miss, especially those of us that defend the free market. It's important to remember, first of all, Smith was a moral philosopher, not an economist. He'd written a book previous to The Wealth of Nations called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in which he develops this idea that human beings in sort of social settings, in families and communities, develop natural sympathies for each other. Moreover, Smith himself had criticized Bernard Mandeville, who had argued that greed is good. Mandeville is a Dutchman who wrote this book, The Fable of the Bees, which basically argued about, it was a fable of British society. It argued that all these little greedy bees sort of pursuing their own interests nevertheless led to a productive beehive, but they grumbled because of the moral problem. So Joe finally said, okay, fine, you can all be virtuous. They become virtuous and the beehive falls apart. Okay, so Mandeville, right, was arguing that greed is good. What did Smith say about Mandeville? He said, Mandeville's system is wholly pernicious. Smith was a moral philosopher. He didn't think greed was a virtue. He didn't think selfishness was a virtue. He never said that. The next point is this. Mere self-interest, in Smith's term, is not the same as selfishness. Self-interest, if you look at Smith, is basically what we know and what we're responsible for. So the butcher, he doesn't have to be thinking about the ends or the purposes of his customers. He does have to think, what can I provide that they will freely buy? Right? So he has to be other-directed in that way. But he can simply be concerned about his day-to-day concerns, putting food on the table, affording braces or college education for his children, things like that. That's his self-interest. That's the sort of narrow purview of things that he's concerned with. But that's not the same as selfishness, right? Every time you take a breath, or take your vitamins, or look both ways before you cross the street, right? Or eat 3 square meals a day, or show up to work on time, you're acting in your self-interest. Those things aren't only not bad, they're actually praiseworthy. We ought to do those things. The basis of the golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them to do unto you, is based in a properly ordered type of self-love. So self-interest is not itself morally problematic. The genius of the market, as Smith said, is that people can pursue their narrow self-interest as an end, and nevertheless, because of the incentives of the market, a socially beneficial order can be created. That's entirely different from saying that greed is good. In fact, notice Smith's claim previously. He says, in spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity. His point wasn't that greed is good because it leads to a socially beneficial outcome. His point wasn't that the butcher, the brewer, and the baker ought to be selfish. He says, in spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity. In other words, capitalism, free market capitalism, as long as the rules are set up right, will channel not only legitimate self-interest, but even pernicious greed and other vices into socially beneficial outcome. But saying capitalism channels greed is not the same as saying either that greed is good or that capitalism is based on greed.
Jay Richards is author of Money, Greed, and God. You can watch the full book for him at cato.org.